The moment I saw him, my heart forgot how to beat. It was a Saturday morning in early autumn, the kind of day that smelled faintly of salt and coffee and freshly baked bread, the kind of morning that made me foolishly believe that maybe, just maybe, I could keep pretending the past didn't exist. The market in the town square was alive with laughter, sunlight glinting off glass jars of honey, the murmur of vendors haggling in warm, familiar tones. Luca was tugging on my sleeve, his tiny hand sticky from the strawberry he'd been nibbling, his curls gleaming gold in the soft light. For a moment, I was nothing more than a mother buying fruit for her son, and not a woman who had spent 3 years hiding from the devil she once loved. And then across the crowd I saw him, Nico DeLuca. Time fractured. The world seemed to fall away, sound fading to a low hum that pulsed beneath my skin. I froze, breath trapped in my throat, every nerve in my body screaming in recognition before my mind could catch up. He stood by the olive stand, dark hair gleaming like spilled ink, the sharp line of his jaw catching the sunlight. He wasn't supposed to be real anymore. Not here, not in this quiet coastal town where no one knew who I used to be. But there he was, in a charcoal suit that didn't belong among the woven baskets and homemade cheeses. A man carved out of another world entirely, the one I had clawed my way out of to save myself and my son. For 3 years I'd imagined this moment, though I'd always thought it would happen differently, that if he ever found me there would be sirens, shouting, chaos. Not this silent collision of gazes across a crowd, not this unbearable calm. His eyes met mine, and for a single, shattering heartbeat I was 23 again. His assistant, his secret, the woman who had fallen for the man everyone feared. I felt the old electricity burn through my veins, the pull I had sworn I'd never feel again. I looked away, heart pounding, pretending to focus on the peaches in front of me, my fingers trembling as I picked one up, pretending I hadn't seen him, pretending that the past wasn't standing 10 feet away, watching me like a predator deciding whether to strike. Luca was babbling beside me, asking for more strawberries, and I told him softly, "In a second, sweetheart," though I could barely hear my own voice over the rush of blood in my ears. I told myself it couldn't be him. It couldn't. There were 1,000 men in Italy, or America, or anywhere, with dark hair and sharp cheekbones and shoulders like that. But then I saw the tattoo, barely visible beneath his sleeve when he reached into his pocket. The black serpent coiled around a dagger, and I knew. The air left my lungs in a silent gasp. That mark had once brushed against my skin in the dark, warm and dangerous, a symbol of a world I swore I'd never let touch my child. Panic surged through me. I grabbed Luca's hand, murmured something to him, and began walking fast toward the car, forcing a smile for anyone who looked our way. My heart was a wild thing in my chest. Every step felt like a countdown to disaster. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I knew I'd break. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. We reached the parking lot, and for a moment I thought we'd made it. I bent to buckle Luca into his seat, my fingers shaking so badly I dropped the strap twice. And then, as I straightened, I saw it, resting on the hood of my car. A small blue pacifier. Luca's pacifier. The one he'd dropped at the market not 5 minutes earlier. And beside it, a hand, long fingers, a gleam of silver ring. I followed that hand up to the arm, the chest, the face I'd spent years trying to erase from my memory. He was there, close enough that I could smell him. Cologne and smoke and something darker. Something that had always been uniquely Nico. He was leaning casually against my car, holding the pacifier between his thumb and forefinger, turning it slowly, studying it like it was a priceless artifact instead of a child's lost toy. 3 years? He said softly, his voice smoother than I remembered, but edged with something sharp. And this is how I find you? A pacifier. My mouth went dry. I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. I wanted to lie, to pretend I didn't know him, but his gaze stripped away every layer of pretense I'd built. Those eyes, dark, intelligent, merciless, had always seen through me. He stepped closer, slow, deliberate, until I could feel the heat radiating from his body. You always were terrible at hiding from me, cara mia. The nickname hit me like a blow. My love. The words I used to crave like oxygen now tasted like poison. I tried to step back, but my body refused to obey. I don't know what you're talking about, I stammered, hating how weak my voice sounded, how my heart betrayed me by beating faster instead of slowing down. He smiled then, not cruelly, but with a quiet sadness that unnerved me more than anger ever could. Don't lie to me, Elena. His gaze flicked briefly toward Luca, who was watching us curiously through the car window. Not now. Not when the truth has my eyes. The world tilted, my vision blurred. I wanted to deny it, to scream that he was wrong, that Luca was mine and mine alone. But the truth hung between us, alive and undeniable. Luca's dark curls, the golden tint in his skin, the shape of his mouth, all echoes of the man standing before me. How did you find me? I whispered. Nico's expression didn't change. You left me for dead, he said, voice low and steady. But you didn't cover your tracks as well as you thought. I've been patient, amore mio. Too patient, maybe. But then, he lifted the pacifier again. The smallest, most innocent thing in the world suddenly transformed into a weapon. This fell into my hands. And now, here we are. Luca called, from inside the car. Mama? His small voice shattered whatever composure I had left. I turned to him instinctively, smoothing my hair, forcing a smile. It's okay, baby, I said, my voice trembling. Mommy's fine. When I looked back, Nico was closer, his presence filling the space between us like smoke. You ran from me, Elena, he murmured, with my blood in your belly. Did you really think I wouldn't come for you? I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he had no right, that he had forfeited that claim the day I heard my death whispered in his world. But fear and confusion tangled with something deeper, something I didn't want to name. I could still remember the way he used to look at me, like I was the only thing in a world of violence that made sense. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his eyes. You don't get to be angry? I said quietly. Not after what I heard, not after what you did. His gaze darkened, confusion flickering across his features, then something like pain. What you heard? He repeated slowly. Tell me, amore mio, what exactly did you think you knew? The question sent a cold tremor down my spine, because the way he said it, soft, dangerous, curious, made me realize that maybe, just maybe, I didn't know everything after all. Nico's eyes lingered on mine, searching, weighing. Then with the faintest hint of a smirk, he slipped the pacifier into his pocket. We'll talk soon, he said, his tone a promise and a threat all at once. I'm not leaving without my family. And then he was gone, melting into the crowd as if he'd never been there at all, leaving me standing beside the car, heart pounding, breath shaking, the scent of him still clinging to the air. I sank into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white, trying to steady the storm raging inside me. He'd found us. After all this time, after all the miles and lies and nights spent looking over my shoulder, Nico DeLuca had found me, and he wanted his family back. But the last time I saw him, someone in his world had wanted me dead. And as the sun dipped low over the sea, painting the horizon in blood-red light, one terrifying thought pulsed through my mind. If Nico didn't want me dead, then who did? Sleep didn't come that night. It never does when the ghosts decide to visit. I lay awake long after Luca had drifted into the soft, untroubled sleep only a child could manage. His little hand curled around the stuffed bear I'd mended more times than I could count. The gentle rise and fall of his chest a rhythm I used to measure my sanity. But my own mind refused peace. It ran wild through the ruins of my past, dragging me back to the beginning, to the moment I first met Nico DeLuca and unknowingly opened the door to my own destruction. It feels like a lifetime ago now, that night in Palermo, the city humming with the pulse of summer, the air thick with the scent of orange blossoms and gun oil. I was 23, newly hired as an executive assistant for a logistics company that, on paper, dealt in imports and exports. But anyone with eyes could see that the real business was built on shadows and fear. My first week there, I realized the so-called company wasn't a company at all. It was a front for the DeLuca family, one of the most feared syndicates in southern Italy. I should have quit, but I needed the job. My mother was sick, the bills were endless, and I thought I could survive if I kept my head down. I told myself that crime couldn't touch me if I refused to touch it back. And then, on my second day, I met him. He didn't enter a room. He claimed it. I remember the first time I saw Nico, tall, composed, and terrifyingly beautiful in a way that felt more like a weapon than a gift. His eyes were the color of midnight before a storm, his suit black and perfectly tailored, the silver of his watch catching the dim light of the office like the glint of a blade. I'd been carrying a stack of files to his office, nervous and clumsy, and when the door opened, I nearly dropped everything. He looked at me for exactly 3 seconds, and in that small eternity, I forgot my name. "You must be the new girl," he'd said in that low, calm tone that could slice through a room without raising in volume. "Elena, isn't it?" I nodded, unable to form words, aware of the way his gaze lingered not in lust, but in assessment, as though he were memorizing the shape of my fear. And yet there was something else there too. Curiosity, interest, a faint softness he probably didn't even mean to show. From that moment, I belonged to him without realizing it. The months that followed blurred into a strange dance of danger and fascination. I was his assistant. Yes, but he began to rely on me in ways that went beyond scheduling or paperwork. I handled his meetings, his calls, his travel arrangements, but soon I was also reading reports about shipments I wasn't supposed to understand, taking messages from men who spoke in code and smiled with dead eyes. I saw things I shouldn't have seen. Money transfers that didn't add up. Security footage wiped clean. Deliveries made at midnight under false names. I told myself not to ask questions, and for a while I succeeded. But Nico noticed everything. "You think too much," he'd tell me, usually with a faint smile that both warned and invited. In my world, thinking can be dangerous. I learned quickly that in his world, everything was dangerous. Loyalty, silence, trust, love, especially love. It started slowly, like a fever. The first time he touched me, it was an accident. Or maybe it wasn't. We'd been at a private dinner after a long day of meetings, and one of his men had been shot that afternoon, the tension thick enough to choke on. I'd stayed late to help him go through the reports, and when I reached to hand him a pen, our fingers brushed. Just a small thing, a whisper of skin against skin. But it was enough to light something raw and electric between us. He didn't move away, and neither did I. The world outside that office ceased to exist in that suspended heartbeat. What followed wasn't planned. It wasn't gentle. It was hunger and fear and something deeper than either. Something that felt like surrender and survival all at once. We both knew it was wrong, knew what it would mean if anyone found out. But we were already too far gone. I still remember the sound of his voice in the dark. The way he said my name like a secret. Like a prayer he wasn't supposed to utter. And for a while I believed he could be both the monster and the man I needed him to be. but the illusion shattered the night I overheard my own death. It was late, long after midnight, and I'd gone back to the office to retrieve a file I'd forgotten. The halls were empty except for the faint hum of a generator and the muffled voices from Nico's private study. I didn't mean to listen, but when I heard my name, everything inside me froze. "She's a liability," someone said, a man's voice, deep and cold. "She knows too much." And then another voice, quieter but unmistakable, said the words that still echo in my nightmares. "Take care of it. No mistakes." Nico's voice. My heart stopped. I remember pressing my hand to my mouth, forcing myself not to make a sound as the realization tore through me like glass. He was ordering my death. The man who had held me hours before, who had whispered "Ti amo" against my skin, wanted me gone. I don't remember leaving. I don't remember packing. I only remember the rain hammering against the streets as I ran, the sound of my own breath loud in my ears, the terror of knowing I was already too late. I bought a bus ticket that night under a false name, crossed borders, burned every bridge, and never looked back. And 2 weeks later, I found out I was pregnant. I laughed and cried at the same time, because life has a cruel sense of irony. I told myself I would raise my child away from the blood and fire of his father's world, that I would protect him from everything that name meant. I swore I would never let Nico DeLuca find us. But he had. Now, years later, lying in the dark with the ocean wind whispering through the open window and the scent of salt on my skin, I can still hear that night echoing through my bones. But there's one detail that keeps clawing at the edge of my memory, something I never let myself examine too closely. The hesitation I thought I heard in Nico's voice that night, the faintest trace of pain, almost as if he didn't want to give the order but had no choice. Could I have been wrong? The thought terrifies me more than anything, because if I was wrong, if Nico hadn't been the one who wanted me dead, then the danger I've been running from all these years wasn't him at all. I roll over, staring at this ceiling, unable to silence the question that now burns like acid in my chest. Who, then, whispered those words in the dark? Who wanted me gone, and why? Outside, a car engine hums in the distance, low and slow, headlights sweeping briefly across the thin curtains before vanishing again into the night. My pulse jumps, a familiar panic flooding back. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just a neighbor or a taxi or someone passing by. But deep down, something in me knows better. Because when I reach instinctively toward the nightstand for the baby monitor, I see it there. A small white envelope that wasn't there before, resting on top of Luca's storybook, its paper marked with a faint smudge of soot and a symbol I prayed I'd never see again. The serpent and the dagger. My breath catches, cold terror flooding every corner of me. Nico hadn't left that behind. He'd never have needed to leave a message, which means only one thing. Someone else has found us too. And this time I don't think they came to talk. When dawn came, it felt thin and brittle like glass about to crack, the kind of morning that carries the taste of salt and dread in the air. I barely remember getting Luca dressed or setting breakfast in front of him, because all I could think about was that envelope, white, anonymous, bearing the serpent and dagger that once ruled every shadow of my life. I kept it hidden in my pocket as if the fabric could somehow shield me from what it meant. All day I watched the street through the kitchen window, every engine that slowed making my heart twist tighter, every knock or shout outside sending small jolts of fear through my hands. The world had grown smaller overnight. The walls of the house, once my sanctuary, now felt like a trap built of my own lies. I tried to tell myself that Nico wouldn't hurt us, that his promise to talk soon meant answers instead of threats. Yet the memory of that emblem told me otherwise. When the knock finally came, it was gentle, almost polite, and somehow that was worse. I didn't need to look through the glass to know who stood there. The air itself seemed to shift, heavy and electric, the way it always did when he was near. Luca was coloring on the floor, humming softly, unaware that the world outside that door was about to swallow everything we'd built. I opened it anyway. Nico filled the doorway like a storm fills the sky, immaculate as ever. But there was something in his face I hadn't seen before. A weariness, a kind of shadow that made him look older than I remembered. He held no weapon, no men behind him, only a bouquet of white calla lilies, absurdly elegant against the rough wood of the porch. "For your mother," he said quietly, as if he still remembered that she loved those flowers, as if 3 years hadn't passed at all. I wanted to slam the door, to scream at him, to demand why he'd come after everything. But his calmness disarmed me in a way rage never could. He stepped inside uninvited. Yet it didn't feel like intrusion. It felt inevitable. The house seemed to shrink around him. The scent of his cologne mingled with the faint aroma of coffee, and the sea breeze sneaking through the window. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I wanted to hate him, but my body remembered every whisper, every night when the world outside his arms didn't exist. He looked around, his gaze landing on the scattered toys, the small shoes by the door, the little signs of a life I'd built without him. And when he saw Luca, the world stopped again. He didn't move. He just looked. Luca raised his eyes from the paper. His crayon paused in midair, curiosity bright on his face. "Who's that, Mama?" he asked, innocent and unknowing, his voice slicing through the silence like sunlight through fog. My throat closed. I wanted to tell him a lie. Something safe. Something that would buy me a few more hours before the truth consumed us. But Nico spoke first, his voice soft, reverent. "I'm a friend of your mother's." Luca smiled shyly and went back to coloring, unaware of how his simple presence had just unraveled every wall I'd built. When I finally found my voice, it was trembling. "You shouldn't be here." He looked at me, eyes dark and endless. "And yet I am." He moved closer, slowly, like a man approaching a wild animal he didn't want to startle. "I didn't come to hurt you, Elena," he said, his tone stripped of the arrogance I remembered. "I came because you need to hear the truth. You've been running from a ghost that isn't mine." I laughed, the sound brittle. "I heard you that night, Nico. You ordered my death." For a long moment he said nothing, just studied my face as though reading the years written in the lines around my eyes, the fatigue of endless fear. Then he sighed, and the sound held more sorrow than I was prepared for. "You heard part of a conversation meant to protect you," he said finally. "Matteo had already marked you. I told him to take care of it, to make sure no harm came to you, not to kill you. By the time I realized you'd run, he made sure I believed you were gone." His words hit me like a physical blow. The room seemed to sway. My pulse thundered in my ears. "Matteo," I whispered. "Your brother?" He nodded once, jaw tight. "He wanted control of the family. You were leverage he couldn't allow. When you disappeared, he told me it was for the best, that the problem had been solved. I believed him because I had to. The war inside the family would have killed more people than I could protect. I wanted to believe him. God help me, I wanted to. But the memories of that night, the fear that had shaped my every breath since, wouldn't fade so easily." "And now?" I asked. "What do you want now?" His gaze softened, a rare vulnerability flickering beneath the steel. "I want to protect what's mine. You. Him." He glanced again toward Luca, who was humming to himself, oblivious. "He looks like me?" There it was, the truth spoken aloud for the first time. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, the years of silence collapsing in an instant. "Don't you dare claim him," I whispered, but the conviction in my voice faltered. Nico didn't argue. He only looked at me with a tenderness that frightened me more than his anger ever had. "I don't need to claim him," he said. "I just need to make sure he lives long enough to decide who he wants to be." Before I could answer, a sharp crack split the air. A gunshot. Distant but close enough to make the windows tremble. Luca flinched, his crayon dropping to the floor. Nico moved instantly, faster than thought, pulling me toward the ground, his body covering mine in a reflex born of too many battles. The scent of him, the weight of him, the terrifying familiarity of safety in his arms, it all came rushing back, dizzying and unwanted. When the echo faded, we stayed there, breathing hard, listening. Then Nico stood, pulling a small pistol from beneath his jacket, his eyes scanning the street through the thin curtain. "They found you," he said quietly. "Not my men. His. Matteo?" He nodded once. "He knows I'm here. He'll come for you to finish what he started." He turned to me, urgency sharpening his voice. "Pack what you need. We're leaving now." I shook my head, heart racing. "I can't just disappear again. Luca comes with us," he interrupted. "You have no choice, cara mia. If you stay, you die. If you come with me, maybe we live long enough to fix this." The decision that had once taken me seconds, flight over fight, suddenly felt impossible. I looked at my son, at the life I'd built out of borrowed peace, and then at the man who had once been my ruin and might now be my only chance at survival. The gunfire had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. Tires crunched on gravel. Nico's eyes met mine, dark and steady. "Decide now, Elena," he said, extending his hand toward me, palm open, waiting. "Because they won't knock next time." I never really understood how silence could be so loud until that drive through the night with Nico. The city lights dissolved behind us like a dream that was already forgetting itself, and every mile that passed felt like I was being unstitched from the life I had built and sewn back into a world I'd sworn never to touch again. Luca slept in the back seat, his little head tipped against the window, his curls catching the faint reflections of the dashboard lights. And all I could think about was how the same blood that ran through Nico's veins was quietly pulsing in that small, innocent body. I wanted to hate Nico for that, for the way his existence had written itself into mine so deeply that even my child was a living echo of him. But hate is a clean emotion, and what I felt was anything but clean. Nico drove in silence for hours, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes on the dark ribbon of road ahead. Occasionally, his gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, scanning for headlights that didn't belong. And every time he did it, I felt the pulse of danger creeping closer, like a storm building behind us. I asked him where we were going, and he told me, in that calm, unyielding way of his, that there was a safe house on the coast, a villa that belonged to someone who owed him a debt. The word safe sounded almost ironic in his mouth. As dawn began to bleed into the horizon, the outline of the sea appeared, a vast, restless sheet of silver and black. And with it, memories of another coastline, another version of us, came rushing back. I remembered the nights in Sicily when he would take me out on his balcony overlooking the water, his arm around my waist, his breath warm against my neck, telling me that the ocean belonged to no one, not even to men who thought they owned the world. I had believed him then, because he said it softly, and I was young enough to think softness in his voice meant safety. The villa stood at the end of a narrow dirt road, hidden by tall cypress trees, and the kind of silence that felt old, like it had been waiting for centuries. Nico parked the car behind a wall of ivy and opened my door before I could protest, his hand resting lightly at the small of my back as he guided me inside. The gesture was familiar, protective and infuriating all at once. Inside, everything smelled of salt, lemon oil, and dust. The shutters were half open, letting in stripes of morning light that cut across the floor like blades. Luke awoke and clung to my leg, his small body trembling with the leftover fear of being uprooted in the middle of the night. I knelt and held him, whispering that everything was fine even though I didn't believe a word of it. When I stood again, Nico was watching me with that unreadable expression he wore like armor. "You need rest," he said, and though his voice was low, it carried the authority of command. "You and the boy will stay in the East Room. I'll have someone bring food and clothes." I wanted to tell him that I didn't take orders from him anymore, that he couldn't just walk back into my life and decide what was best for us, but the exhaustion in my bones swallowed the argument before it could reach my lips. I followed him down a corridor lined with old paintings and the faint echo of the sea outside, and when he opened the door to the room, sunlight spilled over white sheets and a balcony overlooking the cliffs. It should have been beautiful. It felt like a cage. After Luca had fallen asleep again, I stepped out onto the balcony. The sea stretched endlessly below, the waves breaking against the rocks in slow, deliberate violence. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the sound of peace, but all I could hear was the hum of memory. The last time I'd been this close to him, the way his voice had sounded when he'd told me he loved me, the way I had believed that love could erase the blood on his hands. When I turned, he was standing in the doorway, watching me. The morning light carved shadows across his face, softening the edges of the man I remembered, but not the danger that lived behind his eyes. "You don't trust me," he said, and it wasn't a question. I laughed quietly, bitterly. "Trust? You're the reason I've spent 3 years sleeping with one eye open." He took a slow step closer. "And yet here you are, letting me protect you." "I didn't have a choice," I whispered. He stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the faint scar near his jaw, a reminder of the world we had both bled in. "You always have a choice, Elena. You just don't always like what it costs." Something in me snapped then. The fear, the anger, the love I had tried so hard to bury all colliding in a single breath. "You don't get to talk about choices. You took mine the moment you dragged me into your war." His jaw tightened, but instead of anger, I saw something like regret flicker there. "I'm trying to end that war," he said softly. "Matteo has already sent men after you. They won't stop. I can't lose you again." The sincerity in his voice was a dangerous thing. It made my chest ache, made me want to believe him even though I knew belief could be fatal. "And what happens when it's over?" I asked. "Do we just pretend the last 3 years didn't happen?" He reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from my face, his touch gentle but charged with all the history between us. "Nothing can erase what happened," he murmured. "But maybe we can start from what's left." Before I could answer, a sudden crack of thunder rolled in from the sea. Not weather, but something else. Nico's phone buzzed, sharp and insistent, and when he looked at the screen, his entire body went still. I saw it in his eyes before he spoke, the shift from man to predator. "They found us," he said quietly. "He's not waiting anymore." I felt the air leave my lungs. "Matteo?" He nodded, already moving toward the door, his voice low but steady. "Stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." The memory of the last time I'd heard those words came rushing back. The night I'd run, the night I'd lost everything. And something in me refused to obey. "I'm not hiding again," I said, surprising both of us with the strength in my voice. "I'm not going to let you fight for us alone." He turned back, eyes burning with equal parts fury and admiration. "You have no idea what you're saying." "Maybe not," I said, lifting my chin, "but I'm done being the woman who runs." For a heartbeat, the world held still between us. The past, the pain, the unspoken love. And then the sound of engines tore through, the silence, closer this time, unmistakable. Nico drew his gun, the metallic click loud in the quiet room, and the look he gave me was half warning, half promise. "If they get through that gate," he said, "this house becomes a war." And as he disappeared down the hall, I stood there clutching the edge of the balcony, the salty wind whipping through my hair, realizing that I had just stepped back into the fire I'd spent 3 years escaping, and that the man I once fled from might be the only thing standing between my child and death. The night broke open with the sound of gunfire, the sharp rhythm of it echoing off the cliffs, like the heartbeat of something monstrous and ancient. And in that instant, I understood that safety had never been real, that every breath I'd taken since Nico found me had been borrowed from a world that wanted to collect its debt. I remember grabbing Luca from the bed, his small body heavy with sleep and fear, pressing his face against my shoulder so he wouldn't see the flicker of muzzle flashes outside the windows, the brief, ugly strobe of violence turning the villa's white walls into a canvas painted in light and shadow. Somewhere below, Nico's voice cut through the chaos, calm and commanding, that particular tone that could bend grown men to obedience and make even death hesitate before touching him. He told me to stay hidden, but the sound of his voice was both a comfort and a chain, because I couldn't obey, not anymore. Not when I knew that every bullet out there had my name or my child's name carved somewhere into its shell. I crept toward the staircase, Luca's soft sobs muffled against my neck, and from the landing I could see fragments of the battle unfolding below. The flash of black suits, the shimmer of glass shattering, the sudden terrifying beauty of Nico moving through the smoke like something born of it. There was no hesitation in him, only precision, as if he had already died once and knew exactly how much of himself he could spend to protect what was left. A figure broke from the darkness, one of Matteo's men, maybe more than that, and when Nico turned, I saw the man raise his gun. The shot came too fast. I didn't think, I only screamed his name, and that half-second of distraction saved his life because he shifted just enough for the bullet to graze his arm instead of his heart. He looked up at me then, just long enough for our eyes to meet across the chaos, and the expression on his face, equal parts fury and relief, was something I would remember even in dreams. When the shooting slowed, replaced by the low moans of the wounded, and the hiss of smoke drifting through the broken windows, I carried Luca back to the bedroom and locked the door. But my hands were shaking so badly that the key slipped twice before it turned. I told him stories while we waited. Stories about the sea and the stars. Anything that would keep him from asking questions about the noise outside, but the truth hung heavy in the air like gunpowder. I couldn't protect him forever. Hours later, when silence finally settled like dust, Nico came back, his arm wrapped in a strip of torn linen, his shirt stained dark, but his eyes still impossibly clear. He didn't knock, just pushed the door open, and for a moment the sight of him there, alive and unbroken, undid me completely. I wanted to run to him, to press my hands against his chest and feel his heartbeat, to make sure he was real, but pride held me in place. "They're gone," he said, voice rough with exhaustion. "For now." "For now," I repeated, the words tasting bitter, because I'd learned that for now is only another way of saying until next time. I told him I wanted the truth, every piece of it, and for once he didn't try to shield me with silence. He sat at the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor, and began to speak about Matteo, about the fracture that had been growing inside their family long before I ever walked into his office with a stack of files and a trembling heart. He said Matteo had built his empire on betrayal, that my disappearance had been the last move in a long game of control, that killing me had been meant not just to punish Nico but to break him. And somewhere in that confession lay the cruelest truth of all. The moment I ran, Matteo won. I wanted to tell him that I understood, that I believed him, but belief is a fragile thing, and part of me still heard the echo of that night, the whispered order, the certainty of my own name spoken as a death sentence. You could have found me sooner, I said, and the accusation slipped out before I could stop it. He lifted his gaze then, and what I saw there wasn't anger but something far heavier. Guilt, raw and unguarded. I tried, he said quietly. I searched everywhere. Every lead died before I reached it. Matteo made sure of that. Outside, the first light of morning began to creep through the broken shutters, staining the room gold. But it felt like a cruel trick, because nothing about this moment was clean or new. I turned away, clutching Luca's blanket to my chest, and whispered, "You don't know what it's like to live every day waiting for a ghost to catch up to you." His hand brushed my shoulder, tentative, almost hesitant. "I do," he said. "You were my ghost." The simplicity of it broke something in me. I wanted to stay angry, to keep the distance that years of fear had built between us, but the warmth of his touch and the sincerity in his voice melted through the cracks faster than I could patch them. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, the air between us thick with the scent of smoke and salt, and everything we'd lost. Later, when Luca finally fell asleep again, Nico told me he'd intercepted a message before the attack. A coded transmission from someone inside the villa. "There's a traitor here," he said. "Someone fed Matteo our location." The words chilled me. It meant that even within these walls, the danger hadn't passed. He swore he'd find out who it was, that he'd tear down anyone who dared to put me in danger again. But I could hear the fatigue in his voice, the weariness of a man who has fought too long without rest. That night, while he was downstairs making calls, I walked through the silent halls of the villa, past the shattered glass and overturned furniture, and found myself in the old study. Papers were scattered across the floor, the air still smelling of gunpowder and burnt wood. And there, half buried under a fallen chair, I found another envelope, identical to the one that had been left on my nightstand days before. The same white paper, the same emblem of the serpent and dagger. But this one wasn't sealed. It was open, and inside was a photograph. It was me, standing in the market with Luca the morning Nico found us. The image was crisp, recent, and in the corner was a smudge of ink where someone had written a single word, "Soon." I felt the blood drain from my face. Whoever had taken that photo had been close, too close, and if Matteo's men had been outside that day, then they'd known where I was long before Nico arrived, which meant someone had told them. Someone who knew I was there. Someone who wanted both of us caught in the same trap. When I heard Nico's footsteps behind me, I didn't turn immediately. I just held up the photograph, my hands shaking. "It's not over," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. He took the picture, his eyes narrowing as he studied it, and when he finally looked up, there was a new kind of darkness there. Not rage, but cold certainty. "No," he said. "It's just beginning." And in that moment I knew that whatever truth was still buried between us was about to surface, and when it did, it would either save us or destroy us completely. By the time the sun had disappeared behind the sea, the villa no longer looked like a refuge. It felt like a mausoleum waiting to decide whose name it would carve into its walls. Nico had ordered the surviving guards to patrol the perimeter, their radios whispering like restless ghosts in the hallways. And every distant footstep made me jump because I couldn't shake the feeling that one of those footsteps belonged to the traitor still hiding among us. The photo I'd found burned in my pocket like a live coal, and even though Nico promised he would find whoever betrayed us, I had seen the exhaustion in his face, the slow bleed of trust leaving his body one drop at a time. He wouldn't rest. All night he moved from room to room, giving instructions in a voice so controlled it frightened me more than shouting ever could. I watched him from the balcony, the pale light of the moon spilling over his shoulders, and for the first time I realized that he wasn't the invincible figure I'd built in memory. He was a man, unraveling quietly beneath the weight of everything he'd done to keep control of a world that never really belonged to him. And somehow that made him more dangerous, because desperation gives power to love and fear alike. When the house finally grew still, I went downstairs to find him. He was in the old wine cellar, a glass in his hand, staring at the maps spread across the table, maps marked with names and numbers that looked more like confessions than strategy. The dim light caught the bruise blooming along his jaw, the bandage on his arm already soaked through with the faintest trace of blood. He didn't hear me approach until I spoke his name, softly, and when he turned, the cold hardness in his eyes softened for a single heartbeat. "You should be asleep," he said, and I almost laughed because the words sounded absurd in a place where sleep had become an act of faith. I told him I couldn't, that every time I closed my eyes I saw Matteo's men storming through the door, saw Luca's face vanish in the smoke. Nico set the glass aside, crossed the space between us, and for a moment neither of us spoke because everything that needed to be said already hung in the air like a pulse between two bodies too close to pretend they were strangers. He told me that the traitor was close, that he had narrowed it down to one of the guards Matteo had placed in the household years ago under a false name. "He's still here," Nico murmured, "and until I find him, no one is safe." The words should have terrified me, but what terrified me more was the way his voice shook when he said them, as though safety had become something personal, something he wasn't willing to lose again. I reached for his injured arm without thinking, wanting to check the bandage, but when my fingers brushed his skin, he caught my wrist, not harshly, only enough to still me. His eyes searched mine, the question in them older than either of us. "Why didn't you tell me about him?" he asked, meaning Luca, meaning everything. I told him the truth, the fear, the misunderstanding, the night I'd overheard his voice ordering my death. "I thought you wanted me gone," I said, and he closed his eyes as if the words themselves cut deeper than bullets. When he looked at me again, there was no anger left, only a quiet sorrow that felt more dangerous than rage. "If I'd known," he whispered, "I would have burned the world to find you." And maybe it was exhaustion or fear, or the memory of what we had been. But in that moment, something inside me finally broke. I stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat of him, the scent of smoke and wine and salt, and for a long time we just stood there breathing the same air, neither of us brave enough to start the fire we both felt burning between us. He kissed me first, not like a man claiming, but like a man remembering what it was to be alive. The years between us dissolved into that single, endless heartbeat. The walls of the cellar, the blood, the betrayal, all of it faded beneath the weight of a truth too heavy to deny, that I still loved him, and maybe I always had. When he pulled away, his forehead rested against mine, his breath ragged. "This doesn't change anything," he said, though his voice betrayed him. I nodded because we both knew it changed everything. Later, when I returned upstairs, I found Luca asleep clutching the stuffed bear, unaware that the world beneath him was shifting again. I sat beside him, tracing the curls at the back of his neck, and wondered what kind of life he would inherit from two people who loved each other through violence and fear. I promised myself that whatever happened, I would end the cycle before it reached him. The next morning, the sea was calm, deceptively so. Nico gathered his men in the courtyard, his expression carved from stone, and told me he was leaving for a few hours to confront one of Matteo's lieutenants, who might know the traitor's identity. I wanted to argue, to tell him that walking into another trap was madness, but he kissed my forehead, whispered that he'd be back before sundown, and disappeared through the gates with 2 cars trailing behind him. I stood there until the sound of engines faded into the distance, a hollow ache blooming where fear had been. For the first time in days, the villa felt empty. The guards moved quietly, the sea wind sighing through the corridors. I tried to keep Luca occupied with drawing, pretending that crayons and paper could hold back the memory of gunfire, but a strange unease kept crawling up my spine. When I went downstairs to the study to fetch a book for him, I noticed the door to Nico's private office slightly ajar. I told myself not to look, that it was none of my business. But curiosity and dread are siblings that never travel alone. Inside, the desk was cluttered with files, photographs, coded ledgers, names of men I didn't recognize. But among them was a single piece of paper that froze me where I stood. A message written in an unfamiliar hand, dated the day before Nico found us at the market. Target located. She's in Amalfi, awaiting further instruction. The signature at the bottom was a name I knew too well. Marco, the guard who had been with Nico for years, the one I had seen outside the villa moments before the first attack. The realization hit like ice water. Marco was the traitor, and Nico had taken him with him that morning. I ran to the balcony, the sea stretching endlessly below. But the horizon was empty. No sign of cars returning, no sound of engines climbing the hill. Only the cry of gulls and the whisper of waves, indifferent and eternal. I grabbed the phone on the table, dialing the number Nico had given me for emergencies, but it went straight to silence. Somewhere deep inside, instinct whispered that I was already too late. When I turned back toward the room, a shadow moved near the door. Marco stood there, smiling, faintly, his gun glinting in the dim light. And for the first time I understood what real betrayal looked like. Not in words, but in the calm confidence of a man who knows he's already won. He raised a finger to his lips. "Where's the boy?" he asked. I felt the world tilt, my heart turning to glass inside my chest. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled over the water, low and distant, and I knew that whatever peace we'd tried to build in this house of ghosts was about to shatter all over again. The moment I saw Marco standing in the doorway, the gun catching the weak afternoon light, I knew that all the nights I had spent convincing myself the danger was outside had been a lie, because the real threat had been breathing our air all along, waiting, patient and silent, for the perfect second to reveal itself. My first thought wasn't of myself, but of Luca, and I remember the way my body moved before my mind could catch up. The way instinct took the shape of a mother's fear. Raw, fierce, and absolute. I stepped between Marco and the hallway that led to the bedrooms, feeling the cold edge of the pistol's stare before the words even formed in my mouth. He told me not to scream, though his voice was almost gentle, almost weary, as if this betrayal had exhausted even him. He said Matteo had promised him freedom, money, and something more valuable. A life outside the endless shadow of the De Luca name. "You were never supposed to get caught in it," he said, the absurdity of the statement almost making me laugh. Because here we were, my son and I trapped again in a war, born from men's hunger for power disguised as loyalty. I tried to reason with him, my voice shaking but steady enough to sound like control, asking him what Matteo wanted now that Nico had already lost everything that could be taken. Marco's answer came without hesitation. Matteo didn't want what Nico had. He wanted what Nico loved, because destroying that was the only way to end him. The words crawled through me like ice. He made me walk ahead of him through the corridor, the barrel of the gun never far from my back, his steps silent on the old marble floors. The villa felt heavier with every room we passed, the air thick with the echo of the storm building outside. When we reached the grand hall, the windows flashed with lightning, and for a moment I saw our reflections. Him, calm and certain, and me, wild-eyed and trembling, clutching the last thread of courage I still possessed. I told him that Luca was sleeping, that he didn't have to be part of this. But he shook his head, explaining in that same calm tone that Matteo's orders were clear. Bring the child as proof. Use him to draw Nico out, and then finish what should have been done years ago. You can make this easy, he said, or you can make it messy. Something inside me hardened at that. because I realized that fear would not save my son. Only time would. And so I gave him what he wanted, most, a delay. I told him I needed to pack Luca's things, that the boy would panic if we dragged him into the storm without his bear, and he hesitated just long enough for me to see the faint glimmer of guilt behind his eyes. I used it. Every second he gave me, I stretched into 2, into 3, until the thunder drowned out the ticking of the clock. While I gathered Luca's blanket, I whispered to him that we were playing a game, that he needed to hide under the bed and stay silent no matter what happened. His eyes were wide, full of confusion, but he nodded because children understand fear even when they don't have words for it. I kissed his forehead and turned back toward Marco, praying he hadn't seen. We stepped into the hallway again, and I could hear the distant growl of engines climbing the hill, the sound of cars fighting against the rain-slick road. Hope flared inside me so suddenly it almost hurt. Nico was back. Marco heard it too. His jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward the front entrance. He wasn't supposed to return this soon, he muttered, and for the first time I saw uncertainty crack through his composure. Lightning split the sky, throwing his shadow across the walls. In that flash of brightness, I saw the moment to act, and though every muscle screamed against it, I lunged, shoving against his arm with all the strength fear could give me. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the narrow corridor, and the bullet buried itself in the wall beside us. I ran. I didn't think, didn't breathe, only ran, the thunder outside swallowing the sound of my footsteps as I darted toward the staircase. I heard him curse behind me, heard the scrape of his shoes against the marble, and then another shot. Pain flared across my shoulder, sharp and searing, but I didn't stop. The front doors burst open just as I reached the landing, and Nico was there, drenched from the rain, eyes blazing like a man dragged out of hell. His gun was already raised before the echo of the storm could fade. The world slowed, the smell of gunpowder, the metallic taste of fear, the single heartbeat that decided everything. Marco fired first. Nico moved faster. 2 shots, overlapping, indistinguishable, and then silence so complete it felt like the air itself had been torn away. Marco fell first, his weapon clattering across the floor, the light fading from his eyes as he whispered something I couldn't hear. I collapsed against the railing, the pain in my shoulder suddenly real, the weight of adrenaline fading into exhaustion. Nico was beside me in seconds, his hands on my face, his voice low and frantic, asking where I was hit, if Luca was safe, if I could hear him. I wanted to answer, but the world tilted, and for a moment all I saw was the fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for us. He carried me to the sofa, tore a strip from his shirt to press against the wound, his hands shaking just slightly despite all his years of control. When I finally caught my breath, I told him what Marco had said, that Matteo's real target was not him, but the family he'd built out of defiance. And I saw something shift in Nico then. A terrible calm, the kind that comes when a man decides the war is no longer about survival, but retribution. "He won't touch you again," he said, and the promise in his voice was so absolute that it frightened me more than the gunfire. Later, after he made sure Luca was safe, Nico went to the window, staring out into the rain. His back was to me, but I could feel the storm gathering inside him, silent and deliberate. "It ends now," he murmured, almost to himself. "Matteo took everything from me once. I'm not giving him what's left." I told him that revenge would only feed the same darkness that had already devoured so much of his life. But he turned toward me with eyes that burned like the sea under lightning. "This isn't revenge," he said. "It's the only way to keep you breathing." The truth hung between us, terrifying, inevitable. I knew that nothing I said could stop him, that love had already become another weapon in this war, one neither of us could lay down. He kissed me once, hard and desperate, the kind of kiss that feels like both a promise and a goodbye. And then he left. his silhouette swallowed by the storm. When the sound of the engines faded again, I stood by the window, clutching Luca's bear to my chest, and watched the waves crash against the rocks far below. The thunder rolled on, endless and distant, and I realized that I was no longer just running from death, but from the part of me that still believed Nico could win this without losing his soul. Somewhere out there, Matteo was waiting, and between them stood everything I loved. The next time I saw Nico, I knew it would be on a battlefield, one built from blood, secrets, and the kind of love that always ends in fire. The storm didn't end when Nico left. It only changed shape, moving from the sky into the hollow space he left behind. The villa trembled under the wind, the windows rattling like bones, and every flash of lightning drew his silhouette in my memory. The way his shoulders squared before he walked out, the wet darkness of his hair, the quiet conviction of a man walking toward his own damnation. I wanted to follow him, but the bandage around my shoulder still throbbed, and Luca slept curled beside me, his small breath steady against my ribs, and I couldn't decide which was heavier, the wound in my flesh or the one in my heart. All night I paced the rooms, listening to the thunder echo across the sea, every roll of it sounding like distant artillery. I knew what Nico was walking into. Matteo would not settle for negotiation or mercy, only for spectacle. The De Luca brothers had built their kingdom from blood, and they would finish it the same way. I kept telling myself that Nico had survived worse, that he was too clever, too ruthless, too lucky to die, but every whisper of the wind through the broken shutters sounded like goodbye. When the sky began to pale, I couldn't stand the waiting any longer. I found the keys to one of the jeeps parked behind the villa, wrapped Luca in a blanket, and whispered that we were going to find his papa. He nodded with the solemn trust only a child could give, his eyes still heavy with sleep, and that faith, so pure, so undeserved, was the only courage I had left. The road wound down the cliffs like a scar, the rain slick beneath the tires, the horizon smeared in gray. The air smelled of salt and diesel and something metallic that I refused to name. When we reached the edge of the old industrial district, I saw them. Black cars lined along the warehouses, men moving like shadows between them. I parked behind a crumbling wall and told Luca to stay hidden, my voice trembling but firm, promising I'd come back for him. He gripped my hand so tightly it hurt before he let go. The closer I crept, the louder the echoes became. Gunfire muffled by distance, the low roar of engines, the sharp cry of men giving orders in voices I recognized. I moved through the ruins, the rain turning everything slick and shining, and then I saw him. Nico stood in the open courtyard, soaked to the bone, facing Matteo across a stretch of concrete littered with glass and spent shells. There were only a handful of men left on either side, and between them lay the wreckage of the empire they had both tried to own. Matteo was everything Nico wasn't. Reckless where his brother was precise. Hungry where Nico was haunted. His smile was thin. A wound in his face. "You should have stayed gone," he shouted, voice ragged against the wind. "You were always the weak one." Nico's answer came calm and steady, cutting through the rain. "Maybe. But you forgot what weakness makes a man do when he has nothing left to lose." I watched as they circled each other. Two halves of the same ruin, and I wanted to scream, to run between them, but fear pinned me in place. The first shot cracked the air, then another, until sound and light blurred together. Nico moved like a dancer carved from fury, every motion deliberate, his eyes never leaving Matteo's. He took a hit to the side but didn't fall. Matteo stumbled, cursing, blood blooming across his sleeve. It should have ended there, but hatred never ends cleanly. It drags everything with it. When Matteo realized he was losing, he turned toward the cars, toward the men still waiting, and shouted something I couldn't hear. The next moment I saw one of them lift a weapon not toward Nico but toward me. Somehow Matteo had seen me in the shadows. I ran, shouting his name, the sound tearing from my throat, and Nico turned just in time to see the muzzle flash. He didn't hesitate. He moved faster than the bullet that would have found me, his body colliding with mine, pushing me to the ground. The impact stole the breath from my lungs. The warmth that spilled over my hands told me what had happened before I dared to look. The world became a blur of noise. Gunfire, thunder, the metallic scent of blood mixing with rain. I remember screaming his name, pressing my palms against the wound, begging him to stay awake. He smiled faintly, his lips pale, his hand finding my cheek. "I told you," he whispered, each word a struggle. "I would never let anyone touch my family again." Behind us, Matteo staggered forward, wounded but still standing, raising his gun for the final shot. Something inside me broke free then, a sound that wasn't a scream so much as the release of every fear, every night of running. I grabbed the weapon from Nico's side, the metal slick under my fingers, and I fired before he could. The recoil jolted through my body. Matteo fell without a sound, the expression on his face one of disbelief more than pain. And then there was only rain. I don't know how long I sat there, holding Nico, whispering his name, promising him things I didn't know how to keep. He kept his eyes open long enough to see Luca running toward us, small feet splashing through puddles, his cry cutting through the storm. Nico's hand moved to touch our son's hair, trembling, reverent, and the sight of it, father, mother, child together in the middle of the wreckage, felt like a prayer offered to a God who never listened. Sirens wailed in the distance, police, ambulance, or perhaps just more ghosts drawn by the noise of the end. But I didn't move. When Nico's men finally reached us, their faces white with shock, I let them lift him, let them pull me to my feet. The sky was beginning to lighten, a faint promise of dawn threading through the storm clouds, and for the first time in years I didn't feel the need to run. As they carried him toward the car, his voice came faintly through the wind. "It's over," he said. "We're free." I wanted to believe him, wanted to cling to that word like salvation, but freedom, I had learned, always demands a price. I followed the car down the road until it vanished into the gray horizon, the smell of smoke and salt lingering behind. And when I turned back, Matteo's body lay still among the puddles, the rain washing the last traces of his empire into the sea. Standing there, soaked and trembling, I realized that love and violence are born from the same place. Both are acts of surrender. Both burn everything they touch. And yet we chase them because in their fire we feel alive. I looked at Luca, who was watching the horizon with wide eyes, and whispered that we were going home, though I wasn't sure where home was anymore. Behind us, the sun finally broke through the clouds, pale and uncertain, and in its light the sea looked almost kind, as if the world itself wanted to forget what had happened. I knew it never would, and neither would I, but for that single moment, with the storm fading and my son's hand in mine, I let myself believe that Nico's words were true, that somewhere between blood and fire, we might still find a way to begin again. Morning came quietly, but it wasn't peace. It was the silence that follows destruction, the kind that feels borrowed and fragile, as if the world itself were holding its breath to see who would rise and who would remain buried beneath the wreckage. I remember sitting in the small clinic by the harbor, the white walls humming with the smell of antiseptic and salt, the sound of the sea faint beyond the windows, and I thought that if I stared long enough at the door Nico had disappeared through, maybe he would simply walk back out, whole again, laughing at the idea that death had dared to touch him. But the door stayed closed, and every passing second felt like another thread unraveling inside me. Luca slept on the narrow bench beside me, his head in my lap, his curls damp with sweat. The stuffed bear still clutched in his small hand. I stroked his hair and tried to find words for prayers I didn't believe in anymore. The nurse had said the bullet had missed Nico's heart by a whisper, that he had lost too much blood, that they were doing everything they could. But everything never sounds like enough when the person on the other side of that door carries your entire past and the possibility of your future in his veins. I kept thinking about the way he had smiled before they took him inside, the faint curve of his lips that seemed to say, "Don't be afraid." And I hated him for it. Hated the calm, the courage, the certainty that even dying could be an act of control. Outside, the sun had begun to rise, soft gold bleeding over the ruined docks, and with it came the low murmur of men whispering about what would happen next. Who would take Matteo's territory? Whether the DeLuca name still held power? Whether the police would come for all of us, once they pieced together what had happened? Every word felt like another reminder that I was still caught in a world that refused to let me go. I wanted to leave, to take Luca and vanish again. But the thought of walking away while Nico fought for his life only made the air around me tighter, unbreathable. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had become elastic, bending under the weight of waiting. And then one of Nico's men came to me. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. He said the doctors had stabilized Nico, that he was alive but unconscious, that the bullet had lodged close enough to cause complications. I followed him down the corridor, each step louder than the last, until we reached a small room at the end of the hall. Nico lay there, motionless, machines breathing for him, his skin ashen against the white sheets. For a long time I couldn't move. I stood in the doorway, gripping the frame as if letting go would make him disappear. When I finally sat beside him, I took his hand, tracing the calluses on his fingers, the faint scars I remembered from nights long gone. I whispered his name, once, then again, as if repetition could drag him back from wherever he was hiding. "You can't leave me now," I said, the words shaking apart in my throat. Not when I finally stopped running. His chest rose and fell in slow, shallow rhythm, the only proof that he was still tethered to this world. I wanted to scream, to beg, to confess everything I'd never said, the fear, the anger, the love that had lived in me like a wound that refused to close. But the only sound that came out was the quiet sob of someone who has already lost too much. As I sat there, I realized how tired I was of being a ghost in my own life, of loving men who lived by violence and oaths written in blood. I thought about Luca, about the kind of future he deserved, and for the first time I understood that survival and living are not the same thing. If Nico died, I would have to choose between memory and freedom, between raising my son in the shadow of a name that would always draw bullets, or cutting every tie that still bound us to this empire. The choice felt impossible, yet it was already waiting for me in the silence of that room. The door creaked open behind me, and I turned to see one of the older guards, the one Nico trusted most, standing there, his hat twisted in his hands. He looked uneasy, his eyes darting toward the hallway before meeting mine. "There's something you need to know," he said quietly. "The police aren't the only ones looking for him. Matteo wasn't working alone." The words slid into me like a blade. I asked him what he meant, but he hesitated, glancing at Nico's still body before leaning closer. "There's another name," he whispered. "Someone higher, someone who gave Matteo his orders. We found documents in the warehouse, bank transfers, messages. This isn't finished, Signora. Whoever's behind it wants the boy." My stomach turned to stone. I asked him if he was certain, and he nodded once, the gesture small and final. "They'll come for you," he said. "You need to leave before they realize he's alive." Then he slipped out as quietly as he had entered, leaving me alone with the hum of machines and the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I looked at Nico again, at the man who had burned down his own kingdom to save me, and I felt the old fear clawing its way back, sharper now, heavier, because it wasn't over. Not yet. Not by far. The enemy I had thought we'd buried with Matteo was still out there, faceless and patient, and I could already feel its gaze turning toward us. The clock on the wall ticked once, twice, each second louder than the last. Luca stirred in the chair beside me, murmuring something in his sleep, and I brushed the hair from his forehead, whispering a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. "It's going to be all right," I said, even though the air smelled of coming danger. Then Nico's fingers moved, just barely, a twitch against my palm, and my breath caught. His eyelids fluttered, the faintest sign of life fighting its way back through the fog. "Nico?" I whispered. His lips parted, a ghost of sound escaping, and though I couldn't make out the words, I leaned closer until I heard it. A name, not mine, but one I hadn't expected to hear again. He whispered Matteo, then something else, something colder, quieter. He wasn't alone. The monitor beside him beeped faster, his pulse climbing, and before I could ask more, the door burst open. A nurse rushed in, followed by two men I didn't recognize, their clothes too formal, their eyes too sharp for ordinary visitors. One of them flashed a badge, the other simply said, "Mrs. Romano, you and your son need to come with us. Now." Everything inside me went still. I looked from them to Nico, who was fighting to speak, his hand tightening weakly around mine. His eyes met mine, pleading, desperate, and with a voice barely louder than breath, he managed 3 words that shattered whatever hope I'd begun to rebuild. "Don't trust them." The nurse shouted for help. Alarms started to scream, and I felt the hands of the strangers closing around my arms, pulling me back, dragging me away from the bed as Nico's body convulsed under the harsh light. Luca began to cry somewhere behind me, the sound echoing through the hallway, and all I could do was reach toward the man who had given everything for us, his warning still ringing in my ears. The last thing I saw before the doors slammed shut was Nico's face, pale and still, as the machines erupted into a frenzy of sound. And then the world went black under the weight of sirens and the certainty that the storm was far from over. I remember the moment the sirens faded and the stranger's hands finally released me. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, the white walls dissolving into light, and I thought that if I took one more breath I might simply vanish into it. The world had shrunk to the sound of Nico's voice in my head. Those 3 words, "Don't trust them." And everything that followed moved like a dream half-remembered, sharp around the edges yet fluid in the middle, as if time itself were deciding what to keep and what to erase. They said they were government investigators, that they needed me to give a statement about the incident, that Luca and I would be placed under protection until things settled. But the way they avoided my questions, the way they exchanged glances whenever I mentioned Nico's name, told me that protection was only another cage. They took us to a safe house near the cliffs, a sterile apartment that smelled of new paint and distance, and told me to rest. I didn't. I sat by the window all night watching the waves grind against the rocks, feeling the world tilt every time I imagined the machines in that clinic going silent. At dawn, a knock came, soft, hesitant. When I opened the door, the older guard who had warned me before stood there, his coat soaked from the rain, his eyes hollow. He said the men who had taken me weren't police, that they worked for the remnants of Matteo's network, the invisible financiers who had bankrolled the brothers' empire for years. "They want what's left of the De Luca fortune," he said, "and they'll use you to get it." The words fell heavy and cold, a final piece of the puzzle sliding into place. I didn't wait to pack. I wrapped Luca in his jacket, stuffed a few essentials into a bag, and followed the guard into the gray morning. We drove in silence, the roads slick, the sea rising and falling beside us like a creature breathing. He said there was one last person loyal to Nico, a doctor who had moved him after the attack. hidden him from the men who claimed him dead. Every mile felt like a heartbeat, and every heartbeat like a countdown. When we reached the edge of the old monastery high above the bay, I saw the faint glow of lights behind its stone arches, and for a moment I forgot how to move. The air smelled of salt and smoke, and the sound of the bells drifting through the mist felt like memory made audible. Inside, the corridors were narrow and cold, candles flickering along the walls. And then I saw him. Nico was alive. He looked thinner, paler, his arm in a sling, a scar tracing the edge of his collarbone like lightning frozen in flesh. But his eyes, those dark, impossible eyes, were the same. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, both of us afraid that moving would break the illusion. Then he smiled, small, real, weary, and whispered, "You came." I wanted to strike him for making me believe he was gone, but when I touched him, anger dissolved into relief so profound it felt like grief. I told him what had happened, about the false investigators, the whispers of another enemy. He listened without interrupting, his hand wrapped around mine, grounding me in the middle of the chaos. When I finished, he nodded once, as if he had already expected this outcome. "There's always someone above," he said quietly. "Matteo was just a face. The real power never bleeds in public." He explained that before the final confrontation, he had sent coded evidence, records of the family's finances, the names of politicians and businessmen entangled in their empire, to a lawyer overseas. "If anything happened to me," he said, "it would all come out. Now they need you because you're the only link they can still reach." I realized then that the war wasn't over yet, but for the first time I saw a way for it to end without more bodies falling. We decided to run one last time, not as fugitives but as survivors reclaiming their names. At dusk, we left the monastery, following a trail that led to the harbor. The wind was strong, carrying the taste of rain and metal. Luca slept in the back seat, unaware that his parents were preparing to bury a kingdom so he could grow up free of its ghosts. Nico drove slower than he used to, his movements deliberate. And somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, he said, almost casually, "When this is done, I'm done. No more family, no more throne. Just you, the boy, and a house somewhere the sea can't find us." I wanted to believe him, and in the quiet of that moment I did. But peace has never been generous to people like us. When we reached the harbor, 2 cars were already waiting near the pier, their headlights slicing through the fog. I felt the old terror bloom again, the instinct to protect, to hide, to run, but Nico only squeezed my hand. "Stay with Luca," he said. "No more running, not from them, not from me." Then he stepped out into the light. I watched from the shadows as he confronted them. Men in suits, polished shoes sinking into the wetboards, faces too composed for ordinary criminals. They spoke in low tones. I couldn't hear the words, only the rhythm of negotiation turning to threat, of threat turning to the sharp punctuation of a gun being drawn. I wanted to close my eyes, but I couldn't. The sound of the shot came like a thunderclap, single and final. One of the men fell, the rest scattered, engines roaring into the distance. Nico stood alone beneath the pier's flickering lights, the gun still smoking in his hand, the rain falling harder now as if trying to wash the night clean. When I reached him, he looked at me with that tired half-smile that had always undone me. "It's finished," he said. "They won't come again." His voice was soft, certain, the voice of a man who had given back everything the world tried to steal. We left the harbor before dawn, the sky bruised with the first hints of morning, and drove until the sea disappeared behind the hills. Weeks passed. The news spoke of arrests, of empires collapsing under their own weight, of accounts frozen and secrets exposed. I never asked how much of it came from the files Nico had hidden, but I saw the quiet satisfaction in his eyes each time another headline announced the fall of a name that once ruled our nights. We bought a small house inland, a place with olive trees and walls that smelled of sun instead of fear. Luca learned to laugh again. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night and watch Nico sleeping beside me, the rise and fall of his chest steady as the rhythm of waves I could no longer hear. And I'd think that maybe redemption isn't a miracle but a choice repeated every morning. To stay, to love, to begin again. Yet even now, when the wind shifts and carries the scent of the sea across the fields, I feel the echo of our old lives calling. I see flashes of that first moment in the market, the pacifier in his hand, the smirk that ruined my careful peace. And I understand something I couldn't then, that love and danger were never separate for us. They were the same language spoken in different tones. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, Nico found me on the porch, Luca chasing fireflies in the tall grass. He sat beside me, silent for a long time, then said, "If I could start again, I'd still find you." I laughed softly, tears stinging my eyes. "Even knowing how it ends?" I asked. He nodded, gaze fixed on the fading horizon. "Especially then." I leaned against him, listening to the distant hum of the world rebuilding itself, and thought that maybe this was what true love looked like after all. Not perfect, not pure, but surviving. The sky deepened to violet, the first stars blinking awake, and for the first time in years I let myself exhale without fear. The story of us, I realized, was never about hiding or fighting. It was about finding a place where both could exist in the same breath. And as night settled over the quiet land, the ghosts of the past finally grew quiet enough to sleep.